afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of the American Indian. Welcome also to our virtual audience watching the live webcast. We're delighted to have Dr. Catherine Kwik-Uribe speak today on the health benefits of chocolate as part of our Power of Chocolate Festival here at the museum. Dr. Kwik-Uribe is the Director of Research and Development at Mars Botanical, a scientific division of Mars Incorporated. Since joining Mars in 2002, she has managed a research program within Mars Incorporated that examines the potential role of specific cocoa-derived compounds, the cocoa flavanols, to support human health. So very interesting topic today. Before we begin our program, I'd like to remind everyone please to turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disturb the program. There will be time for audience questions after our speaker's presentation. There's a microphone at the back of the center aisle, and if you can go to the microphone with your questions, that way our webcast audience can hear the questions and so can our speaker. And I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Kwik-Uribe.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. This is actually one of my favorite talks to give because, number one, when most of you come in here, you've had a chance to experience what's going on outside and get to see cocoa in a new way. And you're usually very happy. So it's a great way to be able to follow that and to give you some of the science behind what you're experiencing. We've long known in your own lives how important food is. You have a connection as you grew up. There are foods that you loved and you experienced. And you remember today, and if you think about your favorite meal, you can probably begin to taste it even in your mouth. And it's just, food is so connected to us. Chocolate is very unique because as you taste chocolate, you're experiencing something that existed and has been part of culture and life for over 34 centuries. So it's a real connection of food to the past. So what I'm going to do today is take you through some of the science, but introducing you to cocoa and a little bit as well, and to take you to modern day in terms of how we look at cocoa and the potential health benefits. So just a brief outline. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cocoa and chocolate production. For some of you who've been outside, you've gotten a quick tour of that. I'm just going to give you a brief overview there. Then give you a little bit about perspective on what's inside cocoa. What are the macronutrients and micronutrients and phytonutrients in cocoa itself? And then explore what does history and epidemiology tell us about the potential health benefits of chocolate and cocoa? And what does emerging science tell us as well? So cocoa is grown really about in very select regions. Though we have a cocoa tree here and we have a cocoa tree up front, this is not where it's typically grown. It's grown about 17 or 18 degrees north and south of the equator. But it's very sensitive. It needs filtered light. It needs very balanced temperatures. And it needs regular rain and high humidity. But as you'll see, it's a tree. Cocoa begins as the cacao plant right here. And like I said, we have one right over here as well. It takes about 5 years before this tree is mature enough to bear fruit. And what you begin with is the flowers themselves. So for a very short period of time, these flowers come out, they open, and they become pollinated. Less than 3% of the flowers on a cacao tree will actually be pollinated and develop into fruit. Some of you may have seen the fruit that's out front. It typically is a little bit bigger than the size of a football. And has a very thick stem. That's really important because these don't just fall off the tree. You actually have to take a machete to go ahead and remove the pod from the tree itself. In about 5 to 7 months, you have a fully grown pod which is ready to be opened, and you see the seeds in here. Now we call these cocoa beans, but these are actually the seeds of the fruit themselves, surrounded by a sweet pulp, which many people, though the seed can be pretty bitter and astringent, the pulp is very, very sweet. Then the pulp is taken, because this bean, as you can imagine, just a bean from a fresh plant, like a squash or something like that, it's very moist inside. So when you think of where cocoa is grown, and then to make it to our households in chocolate or other forms, it has to travel far distances. If it retained a lot of moisture, that would be a problem. So before we can go ahead and we don't consume the seed in this very early state, it actually goes through a process of fermentation And depending on region, fermentation practices can vary, and typically this fermentation process is somewhere around 5 to 7 days. And what happens in that process is that you actually begin to develop some of those flavors that we clearly recognize as being part of cocoa. Once the fermentation process is done, it's allowed to dry, and in most cases it's an environmental drying, open air drying. But the drying is really a critical step because once again it's bringing the moisture down from this fresh seed into something dry which can be toted and shipped to far, far off locations. But the process is not done. We have the seeds, and if you saw the demonstration outside, the seeds actually have a little husk on them, so a little bit of roasting allows you to winnow away the husk. You're left with nibs. If you were to take those nibs and just grind them, and you saw some folks outside doing this demonstration, this is a modern version of what they're doing outside by hand, you actually liquefy that chocolate. You liquefy the seed. If you would allow that to harden, you would get baking chocolate. If you take the nibs and you actually press them, you actually get cocoa butter. Many of us women are familiar with the wonderful beneficial attributes of cocoa butter for the skin. But if you were to if you would expel the cocoa butter and you're left with what's called cake and you were to grind that up, that would be the cocoa powder that many of you have in your pantry. But if you were to keep these components together like it is here and then blend it with sugars and other flavorings, what you would end up with is different degrees of chocolate. White chocolate actually is solely made from the cocoa butter itself. It doesn't contain any of the cocoa solids. But milk and dark chocolate actually contain some portion of what's called cocoa liquor, which is the cocoa base itself. But what's on the inside? As you may know, of course, chocolate or cacao, actually, the seed actually contains quite a bit of fat. The fat is mostly saturated fat, but it's actually the type of fat that's in there has been reported to be actually not cholesterol raising. But it's a lot of fat, and you know that. When you put chocolate into your mouth, what happens? It melts so beautifully if done right. So you recognize that it has fat. It actually has a little bit of protein, some carbohydrate as well, and some fiber. If you were to look at the back of the label of your cocoa powder in your pantry, you'd actually see, potentially 2 to 6 grams, depending on the cocoa powder that you have, of fiber. So not bad. A range of minerals, alkaloids. Now, most of us this morning relied on our caffeine to get us here. But the alkaloids in cocoa are predominantly one called theobromine. This theobromine is actually particularly important. It's a much weaker cousin of, or much weaker relative of caffeine, about 1/10 as potent. But it's very unique in the sense that really no other food that's consumed contains appreciable amounts of theobromine, so it's a great tracer molecule. So when we look at archaeology and ancient uses of cacao, we can actually trace the use of cacao by simply finding traces of theobromine in various pottery vessels. In addition, there are simple phenolic compounds and flavonoids, and this is where my heart is. This is where I spend a lot of time within Mars doing research on looking at the health benefits of these components, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about those in a minute. But flavonoids are all around us. Enjoying a plant-based diet, they're in all the foods that we consume that are plant-based. So whether it's typical fruits and vegetables, whether it's the spices that we use to flavor our foods, whether it's the beverages we drink, the flavonoids are ubiquitous. They're found in all of these types of foods. So the fact that the flavonoids in cocoa is not unique to cocoa, but the fact is, just remember that cocoa starts off as a plant, so it gets to take advantage of the fact that, like many other plant foods, it's rich in flavonoids. And in context of the human diet, there are about 6 main classes of flavonoids: flavonols, anthocyanins, isoflavones, flavanones, and flavones. So there's no quiz at the end of this talk, so I won't ask you to memorize these. The point is that when you talk about flavonoids, you're talking about a big group. So when somebody says this is a flavonoid-rich food, it's almost like saying this is a vitamin-rich food. You don't know, you know that there's something in it that may be of value, but you don't know specifically what's in there. In the context of the diet, flavanols and their structurally related compounds called procyanidins are particularly abundant in foods such as grapes, pears, red wine, green tea, apples, and chocolate. I work here, not too far from here actually, and part of my team is an analytical team, and this is the way that we look at cocoa within our group. We actually do a detailed analysis of cocoa, and we look at these, what are called flavanols and procyanidins. And these are the very specific subclasses of flavonoids that are particularly abundant in fresh cocoa. And this is how we look at cocoa in the lab. why is that important? It's because when we begin to talk further down about the relationship to health, one of the things that's really critical is if you want to establish a relationship between some of the foods that you eat and health benefits, one thing is to know what are the compounds in that food so that you can begin to make direct relationships. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about the history and the epidemiological use. So as you're in the museum today, you've already begun to hear a little bit about the traditional uses. For us, traditional uses are very different than their origins. Historically, cacao was recognized to be able to was used to treat and even prevent any number of things: stomach and intestinal complaints, angina, fatigue. It is Valentine's Day, so we have energy and longevity and virility on our minds, perhaps. But these are areas where, historically, ancient cultures already appreciated cacao was very useful. And what I always appreciate about looking at this slide is that if I were to strike out these couple of lines up here, I could actually say what are the modern uses or what are the modern studies today. So many of these areas are currently under investigation for cocoa and other flavonoid-containing foods as potentially remedies for these various things. But there's also use of cacao in the American colonies. And this is, you have the great advantage to be able here today with American Heritage Chocolate to begin to hear more about how it was used in the colonial era itself. With a demonstration outside, you were able to see the transformation of the beans into a drink itself, which George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin all extolled the virtues of this really nutritious and wholesome beverage. In many cases, when it became to the medicinal uses, there was a general belief that if it was unspiced, it was better for you. But it was recognized for its ability to restore energy, help people regain weight, which you can imagine in the early colonial days when there were many epidemics coming through, which really led to either sickness and illness. Being able to restore energy and gain weight back was pretty important. It was also prescribed as a treatment for such things as asthma. So really there was an appreciation, though today we clearly see cocoa and cocoa products as being confectionery and indulgent. Its early history was so far from that. It was much more about the medicinal and curative properties of this food. So when we look at epidemiology, what is that? Epidemiology is looking at populations across the globe and looking at what they eat and seeing if there's a relationship between what they eat and health. These studies are particularly important because if you could imagine, if I were to ask you, I want to put you in a study, and for the next 30 days, I want you to eat the same thing every single day, and I want to see what happens to you, or 30 days, 60 days, 6 months. Intervention studies, or studies through diet, are really difficult to do because humans like variety, they like change. And the idea of putting you on a very prescribed diet becomes very, very limiting. So the epidemiological studies are really valuable because you can look over years, you can look over decades, and you can see the relationship between diet and specific health outcomes. One of the first studies to link specifically to cocoa was published in 2006. And what they did was a small cohort of elderly men in the Netherlands, the Zutphen Elderly Study, and they looked at their dietary patterns over a 15-year period, their dietary patterns as well as their health history. And what they learned from this is that in this cohort of men, chocolate or cocoa intake was inversely associated with blood pressure and 15-year cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. What does that mean? It means those people who enjoyed a little bit of cocoa or chocolate in their lives basically had overall better health. They had lower blood pressure and they didn't die of at the same rate of cardiovascular disease. A larger study published not too many years ago in 2007 basically looked at a much larger group, because you can say 450, 470 men in Holland, what do they know, right? So here we are now talking about nearly 35,000 women in the US, the Iowa Women's Health Study. And what we did here was the group looked at the 7 subclasses. So if you think back a few slides, I showed you the distinct subclasses of flavonoids. They looked at those subclasses, they looked at what those people were eating, broke them down into what food, the subcomponents of those foods, the flavonoids themselves, and said, those people, when they were in the different groupings in terms of level of flavonoid intake, what was their relationship to health? And what they found was there were specific foods that were positively associated with a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease: apple, red wine, pears, and chocolate. This doesn't sound like a bad lunch or dinner, I think, but Then we have another study, once again, nearly 20,000 adults. Now this is Germany. So part of the value of epidemiological studies is you can look at different regions of the globe, because you also want to know, is this a one-hit wonder? Is it happening only in one region, or can you see evidence that it's happening in other regions as well? In this study, once again, about 20,000 participants, and what they were able, again, look at intake of specific foods, in this case chocolate. And what they found was chocolate consumption appeared to lower the risk of cardiovascular disease, in part by reducing blood pressure. So it seemed to be a little bit of chocolate, in this case about 6 grams a day. So it's not that much chocolate, maybe about the ear off of this bunny. So just a small amount of chocolate per day was associated with a 30% lower risk of heart attack and stroke. Pretty profound. This study actually just published this month. It isn't specific to chocolate, but it pulls us back to flavonoids and flavanols. It's pretty amazing because, once again, this study is about 100,000 people. So the studies are getting bigger, and they're giving us more information. In this case, what they found was total flavonoid intake, and the flavanols specifically were associated with a lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease. So over time, what we're seeing is a very consistent trend. Now I'm going to bring you to the Kuna. The Kuna are an indigenous people off the coast of Panama. What makes them particularly special is the fact that they consume this beverage here. Some of you who are outside got to drink a cocoa-based beverage. This is pretty similar. This urn here, or this vessel here, with the frothing device. And what you have in here is cocoa powder, or crushed cacao beans, with some sugar, some water, maybe some spice or cornmeal or some other things to thicken it, and then lots of time spent in this little vessel frothing it. And this becomes the typical drink they consume. Why is this important? It was recognized several decades ago that the Kuna may be pretty interesting population to look at. Because one thing is, unlike most of us, as they age, they don't develop hypertension. So when they remain on the island, you can see their blood pressure remains pretty consistent. As they emigrate from the island into the suburbs and into Panama City, we see that their blood pressure rises. So they're not genetically protected, which was one of the original ideas, is that perhaps this population has the right genes. And if we understood the genes that they had, then maybe we could understand how those genes might be playing a role in blood pressure or in hypertension, amongst others. But that actually turned out not to be the case, much to the disappointment of the people that were doing this research. But what they did uncover was something fairly unique, which was the fact that when they looked at what they consumed, cocoa was a very predominant beverage in their life. So we believe today that this is a bit of an underestimation of total intake of the cocoa that they were drinking on a daily basis. But also you can say, well, they have a whole different life. They're not consuming the same foods that they would be if they were in Panama City. That's very true. But this is giving us an indication of how important cocoa is to their diet, and maybe suggesting that cocoa could be part of the reason that their blood pressure is maintained at a lower level or maintained through their lives as they age. So what I've shown you now is sort of what we call associations or associative link. So what we're saying is epidemiological studies and even the historical studies were giving us perspective that there's certain foods that are believed to be linked to positive health benefits. With the emergence of databases that allowed scientists to look at the flavonoid components specifically, we get closer, that we're not just talking about a food, but maybe we're talking about specific components in that food that might be beneficial to health. But at the end of the day, all I can say is may be associated. I can't prove to you that it's actually causally related. I can't prove to you, using any of these studies, that this food here caused a benefit. All I can tell you is those people who consumed cocoa or chocolate products as part of their diet appeared to be healthier. So this is where the current state of science is. We're doing, though these studies still take place, we're seeing many more studies here, and that is where people are doing clinical investigations. So doing controlled trials where people are feeding food. So we're not feeding purified compounds. We're not doing drug trials. What we're doing today, and people like Mars and other collaborators across the globe, and industries and universities are doing studies looking at this food itself and seeing what role it may have in health. Why is this important? Because at some point we're going to get to causality. We hope to be able to say that there are specific components in these foods that are positively linked to health. Why? So at one point we'll be able to make recommendations. So at the end of this talk, I can tell you now, I won't be able to tell you what your recommended intake of chocolate is. All of you can go away with your own personal amount, but I won't be able to tell you what the recommended level is. So sorry for the disappointment, but I will tell you that the science is getting to the point where we may one day be able to make recommendations about the level of specific compounds in these foods that you should be getting in your diet on a daily basis. So now I'm going to tell you in just a few slides, really, what does emerging science tell us? But I'm going to give you a little bit of a biology lesson before I dive in. So all of our body is composed of blood vessels. And these blood vessels connect our big toe to our brain. And they're really important. And we used to believe at one point that blood vessels were just sort of passive tubes, that basically just the conduits. What we understand today is that they are actually really very much responsive to change. And so they have their own little system that allows them to respond very readily. So as I talk to you now, if I were to walk across the stage, my blood vessels are immediately responsive to those changes and are adapting very, very quickly. And a molecule that's very much in part of that process is a molecule called nitric oxide. So what happens is, as there's a change, as I walk, and there would be a change in the pressure in the blood vessel itself, this molecule of nitric oxide would immediately be produced and released. And what would happen is the blood vessel will widen, immediately in response to the change in need that my body has. And what it does is immediately goes from this state into a widened state. And what's really nice about this is that you can monitor it real time using an ultrasound device. So as I said, I was introduced, run a research program for Mars. And number one, I can tell you, it's not hard to recruit people to do our studies. I think if we were doing studies on turnips, it would be much harder, but we're doing studies looking at cacao, so generally recruitment is not a big problem. But the other thing is, I don't have to do anything invasive. I allow you to have a product that's specially formulated to be rich or devoid of specific components. And then over the course of several hours, days, weeks, and months, depending on the duration of study that's going on, we can actually look real time into changes within the body. So in this very controlled setting, what you do is you actually apply a blood pressure cuff to the lower portion of your arm. And you inflate it for a period of time. And what that does is actually begin to starve with a little bit of muscle in your arm from nutrients a little bit. Blood is still flowing, but not at the demand rate that it needs. And so what happens is the vessels down here widen because they're saying, I need food, I need things to function, and it's not happening. What happens then is I release that cuff, and the blood from the upper arm rushes into the bottom portion of the arm. And what you do is within 60 seconds, you actually measure the change in diameter of the brachial artery, which is the artery in the upper arm. And literally in 60 seconds, you'll go from this diameter to up to about 10 to 12% change. And it's recognized today that the extent of that dilation it can be a predictor, an early indicator of your risk for cardiovascular disease. So even in the 1600s, it was recognized a man is only as old as his arteries. And really, when we talk today about what we call endothelial dysfunction, that blood vessel itself, when it's able to dilate fully in a very rapid amount of time, the blood vessel is healthy. As we age, as we don't have the best diet, as we don't exercise as much as we want, or as we smoke, or any number of things that we do, what happens is our ability for that blood vessel to respond goes away, or lessens. It doesn't go away, it lessens. So, what happens is that when you begin to get dysfunction of the vessel, you actually begin to set the stage for atherosclerosis, inflammation, all the way down to heart attack and stroke. So measuring this dysfunction early on is a very early indicator of a process that may begin to happen. So in our studies, what we've been doing is looking at how cocoa impacts what's called flow-mediated dilation. So what that means is when the blood vessel is exposed to a change in volume of blood, how quickly does it respond? So what we did here is we looked at people who had one or more cardiovascular risk factors. They might have had high cholesterol, they might have been smokers, they might have been overweight. Their normal, what we call a flow-mediated dilation response, FMD, would typically be in the range of 8 to 12%. But for this age group, they're only about 4%. So they're actually pretty compromised. But their doctor wouldn't necessarily have said that they had cardiovascular disease. They would have said, you have risk factors, you need to be careful, let's try to modify your diet and lifestyle. But here you can see they're clearly on the inside are beginning to be very compromised. So we have drinks with various levels of flavanols in them. This is our control. So the control here isn't zero, and this is one of the challenges of doing any type of nutrition research. What's the control for a glass of wine? What's the control for a banana? What's the control for an apple? When you do drug research, you know you have a specific molecule that you know has a specific effect, and you have a sugar pill or something else as the control. In nutrition research, it's really challenging to develop a control that matches on all nutritional components. But in the case of this study, what we did is we actually used really very heavily alkalized cocoa powder. Alkalization is a process which really destroys the flavanol components in cocoa. So what we can do is we can really beat up that cocoa and that cocoa powder, and we can bring down the flavanol level. But then we have other drinks in which the cocoa powder was treated much more gently through the process from origin through use into the product. So we're able to deliver these very defined levels of flavanols. And what you see here, and over the course of 6 hours, I have the same group of people come in on multiple occasions, and I look at them, and they all start off about here. I give them the control drink on one day, and you'll see very little change over the course of 6 hours. Here's my drink at 330. Here's my drink at over 900 milligrams. And what you see is evidence of a dose response, but you see evidence that over the course of within 1 to 2 hours, you see actually an immediate improvement in the way the blood vessel is functioning. This effect goes away over the course of 6 hours. We have additional data that looks at, well, what is the dose-response relationship? We can begin to see effects around 200 milligrams, and as you go up, and we've studied up to about 900 milligrams at this stage. How do we pick 900 milligrams? I often get asked. It's because if you go back a couple of slides and think of the Kuna, this is what we estimate today as their average daily intake from cocoa of the flavonoid components. So the Kuna are our reference, and this is sort of what we feed in the highest of our studies. So then we've done additional studies where we look at the relationship, because what I've shown you just now is people eat a product which contains these flavanol components and we see an effect. But one of the questions is, well, if it affects my cardiovascular system, that must mean that something's getting into the body. And also I want to know a little bit more about the mechanism. How are the flavanols doing this? So this study, which was published in 2006, was the first time there had actually been a direct link ever established between the flavanols in a food and a physiological effect. So what we see here, once again, is similar to the previous slide. We see here's our control, and here's our 900 milligram beverage. And you see within the course of the same course, about 1 to 2 hours, we see the improvement in flow media dilation, or vessel function. That's paralleled in plasma by an increase in the circulating pool of nitric oxide. So if you remember from the previous slides, nitric oxide is the molecule that was responsible for the dilation of the blood vessels themselves. And so the physiological response is paralleled by an increase in nitric oxide. So these two things support each other. The other thing that's really critical is if I look in the circulation, do I see any flavanols in the circulation itself? And the answer is yes, I do. And the time course of the appearance matches here, or similar to what we see for the physiological effect. So what this slide demonstrates is there's a relationship between when I consume my drink high in flavanols, they enter the body, I trigger a physiological response, the vessel relaxation, and this effect is mediated by nitric oxide. In that previous slide, these were people with one cardiovascular risk factor. In this case, they were smokers. The question is, if I have established cardiovascular disease, do flavanols still work? And the answer is yes. We did a study looking at diabetics. And what we started off with was an acute study, once again, looking at a short-term effect. And many times we get asked, well, if you already saw the effect before, why do you have to repeat this again? The reality is, in diabetics, we just didn't know if we were going to see an effect. And so we wanted to be able to start by saying, do I see something that's happening on a short-term basis? And then does that translate into a long-term effect? So what we see here in diabetics, similar to what we saw in our previous slide, is that we see individuals who consume cocoa, and then within 1 to 2 hours, we begin to see a pronounced improvement in the function of the blood vessel itself. If I have this group go away for 30 days and look at their improvement in function, I can also demonstrate that. So what you see here is this is our control group. So over the course of 30 days, you actually see a slight improvement even in the control group, even though the flavanols are fairly low in this product. And you could think, well, that's interesting, why would that happen? because cocoa is full of many bioactive compounds. And the fact is, even to a small extent, they could be contributing to some of the effects that we're seeing. But in this group here, what you see is the individuals start off about 3%. And then after 8 days, we had them come in. They haven't had cocoa for 12 hours. So this is unlike this slide here, which is saying, or this figure here, which is saying the effect is very short term. In a mere 7 days, we've been able to shift these people from this point to this point. Then we go ahead and we extend them out for 30 days, and that effect still stays. Then if you give them a drink of cocoa in the morning, you still see this effect. So we have retention of this acute effect, even though they're taking it every day. When we originally looked at this data, some people were surprised or thought we might be disappointed at the fact that we don't see much increase. It wasn't much better than day 8. We were not actually disappointed. The reality is, one of the concerns we had is over time, would your body get used to these compounds and maybe not react the same way? And what the study demonstrates, not only does it take that you can get sustained effects, but that these effects can be retained as long as you keep taking the cocoa. We can see reversal of these effects in as short as 7 days. But what does that mean? Because when you think of blood vessel function, that's interesting, but what might it translate to? What it actually might translate to is an improvement in blood pressure. Beginning in 2003, there was actually several studies that were beginning to be published that were suggesting that cocoa products rich in flavonoids may help lower blood pressure. So in this study, which was actually published in the Journal of American Medical Association, they had individuals with an elderly population with systolic hypertension. And what they were allowed to do is for 14 days, or up to 22 days actually, but for 14 days, they were allowed to consume a chocolate bar. In this case, I think it was in the range of 100 grams. I don't know if you can picture that, but an average candy bar is about 40 grams. So this is quite a bit of chocolate. So these studies were done to begin to examine effects. This was not to where we would get to the point where we're recommending anybody consume 100 grams of chocolate a day. I know, such disappointment, but what you see here is that in as soon as about 8 days, you begin to see this drop. And then it stays here. And then if you take, this is when you take the chocolate away, which is grueling, which is very difficult to do, as you can imagine. Take the chocolate away, you can see a reversal of the effect. One of the complaints of that original study was that it was fairly small, I think less than 20 people, and the duration was pretty short, 2 weeks. I mean, most of us can sort of think as the day goes on how much your blood pressure may fluctuate based on the events of the day. In typical medical field, 14-day change in blood pressure, interesting, but it doesn't necessarily prove a long-term benefit. What we see here is in this study, which went across for something in the range of 16 to 18 weeks, what they were able to demonstrate is that you were able to get about a 3 millimeter reduction in systolic and about a 2 millimeter reduction in diastolic pressure. Now, these may not seem to be very big changes. They're not. On an individual basis, these are not very big drops, but if you were to think on a population basis what this might translate to, it could be fairly profound. This could be a 10 to 15% reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality. So if everyone was able to experience this drop, it would have a profound effect on health. And just out this week, actually, was another study where they looked at all the studies on cocoa and chocolate that have been published, and really were able to say, what is the effect of of chocolate, cocoa, and flavanols on cardiovascular health? And what they were able to demonstrate is they found consistent acute effects, which is short term, and then chronic effects related to chocolate or cocoa on this vessel function, this FMD, but also promising effects as it relates to insulin sensitivity. But at this stage, as I've already alluded to, what they say here is this is how just in case you wonder, this is how every scientific paper ever ends, which says, you know, basically it says more research is required. But the fact is, you're getting more and more people across the globe really interested in cocoa and chocolate for health and the promising health benefits that it may have. So the fact that you have so many people doing this type of research, we're actually really moving the field forward to be able to say we can get to the point to begin to make recommendations. So in conclusion, you know, this very brief tour, it's been, going from traditional use, some of the epidemiological work, to the scientific investigations. It's been a very quick tour of the science. But what it should give you perspective on is that cocoa itself has been long been recognized to have unique and beneficial properties. And traditionally, unlike us today, who think of it mostly as a confection, as an indulgent treat, one of those things we hide in the cupboard away from others so we can enjoy personally, it is actually long been used much more for its medicinal and its medicinal and curative properties as a food. But what's exciting, and for me as a scientist, is the fact that modern science is actually looking at some of the ancient history and trying to understand maybe they were onto something, and trying to understand with modern techniques really what is in cocoa. As I said, I have a lab here in Maryland where we spend a lot of time looking at the components in cocoa. And then we partner with people around the globe, and many other people are doing research as well, on trying to understand what's the relationship between these components in food and health. And though more research is needed, there is a growing body of scientific evidence that supports that cocoa, and more specifically, that specific phytonutrient components in cocoa may help to support cardiovascular health. And before you leave here today, I wanted to pull a quote from what's called the Florentine Codex, which was basically a document put together by a Franciscan friar from Spain who came to New Spain and was studying the Aztec and their practices. And what he noted in his book was, when an ordinary amount of cocoa is drunk, it gladdens one, refreshes one, consoles one, invigorates one. Thus is it said, I take cocoa, I wet my lips, I refresh myself. With Valentine's Day just around the corner, the other thing you can keep in mind is that some of the first accounts of use in cocoa in love rituals relates to marriage. A special drink among the Mayans was consumed at the moment of marriage. So as you exchange chocolate and cocoa perhaps with those you love, you're taking part of a tradition that has long been around. So with that, thank you very much. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yes, I have a question. In terms of the diabetes, the study with diabetics, how does that, how did the cocoa butter in there affect type 2 diabetics, which are usually overweight? Was the cocoa butter part of that, or you were able to take that out?
So in most of the studies that are now being done, most often a cocoa powder is used. Cocoa powder is about 10 to 12% fat, in contrast to cocoa sol, or the whole cocoa bean, or baking chocolate, which is about 52, 54% fat. Recognizing that if I have to send people away for 7, 30 days, or even 6 months, I need to think about foods that can be easily incorporated into the diet without adding calories. So in many cases, the studies that have been done have used a cocoa beverage, which can be reconstituted in milk, provides about 90 calories. So we're really conscious about the calories we provide, but that's a very good point, keeping in mind that calories are really important when you're doing these studies.
Thank you.
Hi, great speech.
Thank you.
For those of us who are regular consumers of chocolate, you had mentioned that the alkaloids that are used in processing can reduce the amount of flavonoids that are available. So how should a conscientious consumer go about assessing the level of flavonoids in the chocolate that they're eating?
Very good question. So when you buy a product, you can very easily turn over the nutrition facts panel, and you'll see carbohydrates and fat and protein, because those are all nutrients, and nutrients must be labeled on those products. Phytonutrients are not nutrients. They're not recognized nutrients. Therefore, they're not legally required to be labeled on products. You do have some products out today in which people do make content claims. The challenging area, and this is an area that Mars is working very hard in specifically, is that people use different methods for analysis. So if you imagine if you were going to the grocery store and wanted to buy an orange juice with the highest level of vitamin C, and people were using different ways of measuring them, you would never have a clue which one to buy. It's hard to say which product to go to specifically. Clearly, if you look for products, one of the key would be something like alkalization, but that doesn't always tell the full story. There are raw cocos out there. There are natural cocoa powders. The challenge with all of those, unfortunately, is that fermentation, that process that really develops the cocoa flavors, actually destroys the flavanols a great deal. So over the course of three short days, you can bring the flavanol level down 80%. So even if you're a conscientious consumer and you buy the most unadulterated stuff out there, you could still have very low flavanol levels because of the fact where the cocoa is, or how the cocoa is grown and how it's processed is really, really critical. So there's no easy answer yet, but as the science pushes forward and there's a recognition for these compounds, the methods of analysis will also come, so consumers will be able to have information about how much is actually in this product.
Well, this is a perfect sequential question. How do you, does the cocoa level, does that have anything to do with how many higher flavonoids you have?
Not necessarily. Many have the misconception that the higher percent cacao is an indicator of more flavonoid content or flavanol content, and that's not the case. Some milk chocolates actually have higher flavanol content than some dark chocolates, or 60% cacao. I mean, I have friends that swear by 90%. I don't know how they get it down, but they swear by it because they believe it has the highest flavonoid content. Unfortunately, it's just not that easy. There are companies that are out there that actually try to promote a bit more about how they process the cocoa, and that's probably, so getting more information about the company and how they might process cocoa is probably your best guess, or your best way to get that information. What I would say is, if you enjoy chocolate, find the chocolate you love, balance it in your diet.
And how about shelf life and protecting the flavonoids? Is there a way to store chocolate that would protect this in any way? And is there, you said something about 3 days, but I didn't know if that was in processing or in after you purchase, point of purchase.
The great news is once it's in chocolate or even in cocoa powder, it generally has a very high shelf, or very long shelf life. If it's dry, it tends to have a very long shelf life. So solid chocolates and cocoa powders will be just fine. How you then treat it, if you were then to go ahead and put that cocoa powder with milk and heat it to a high temperature, then you're destroying the flavanols again. So it really is, it's challenging to give an easy answer here, but my only answer would be as gentle as you can be.
And refrigerate or freeze?
You don't have to, and actually you don't have to do that. It's shelf stable, they're fine.
Thank you.
You started out your talk about pollinization, that only 3%, I believe. Is that?
Yes, only about less than 3% of the flowers actually get pollinated and will mature into pods.
That leads me into another question. I would think that Mars Corporation would be very involved in the process, well, in educating people to try to do something about global warming, because it seems like it has had an enormous effect on pollinization with the almonds and with other, flowering plants, and that the countries that now produce the cocoa are going to be strongly affected by this change that we are causing.
So Mars has an active program in different growing regions, so we're very interested in sustainability and actively work in different regions to really make a difference there, not only in terms of how cocoa is grown, but water usage, the use of pesticides and other things. So Mars does have an active program in which we are looking to improve the way cocoa is grown, the integration of its biodiversity. We actually have a research farm in Brazil which is looking at some of these very specific questions. So Mars is an active and engaged partner with global areas and or governmental agencies as well as communities to really make a difference with cocoa.
You mentioned the Kuna and the Mayans. I was wondering if you have any other indigenous peoples that you use in reference in your studies.
Well, Mars has been working in the area of looking at the history of cocoa use for some years now, and outside there you've got some really wonderful experts in the field. But clearly we've done some work, and we're actually looking to do some additional research in the area of looking at the Olmec, so some of the original peoples in Mesoamerica, the Mayans and the Aztec in terms of their use, and some of that research is going on today. Some of the research that I mentioned about looking at theobromine to see how cocoa might have been used in vessels is some of that research that's actually taking place, looking at how cocoa was traditionally used by these cultures.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Uribe. I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV. And you know that as we talk about climate change and the development of food, and we're past 7 billion people, they're talking about trying to reduce the amount of calories and fats and proteins from animal and dairy and other things, and increase, legumes, nuts, beans, vegetables, and fruits. How does chocolate fit into all that, and are you working on studies that show how we can move people into a more plant nut-based, along with chocolate, that would actually reduce obesity and other kinds of diseases and population that's going on around the globe?
So though many of you here may know Mars as a chocolate company, we're actually a global food company. So we do have scientists internally working with various agencies, university partners across the globe, looking not only at cocoa, but also looking at things such as rice and corn, looking at how, if you can imagine, we also make pet food. And the idea today is that, or the realization today is that when you think of the quality of pet food is actually now competing with the human supply chain in terms of some of the protein sources, for example. So Mars is actively engaged in those areas. I am not the person to speak to you about that, but clearly we do have many programs within Mars that are addressing that specifically. Because as a company that's been around for nearly 100 years, we want to be around for at least 100 more. So we need to be engaged in those conversations and addressing those challenges that the global community is facing. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.